There would no doubt be some real memorable people who've come in and just appreciated the help.
Well, I've helped over 100,000 people, so I can't remember all of them.
Sure.
So maybe just a couple of recent ones, because I think one of the more memorable ones recently was a man who made Aliyah from Ethiopia. And when he made Aliyah, he thought that his children from his first marriage had died because he went into the army. As in Ethiopia, many of the men were taken into the army and separated from their families. And when he made Aliyah, he thought that his children were dead. And a couple of years after he arrived, he discovered that one of his children was still alive and was 8 years old. But the Interior Ministry said, well, you've been separated from your child for too long. And he himself converted to Judaism when he was in Israel. So he'd married a Jewish woman in Ethiopia, and he'd converted in Israel, so his child wasn't Jewish. And they said, your child can't come into the country. First of all, we're not even convinced that he's your child. And even if he were your child, you've been separated for too long. And we took on that case. The child was 8 when we took the case on. And by the time we won the case, the child was 18.
Wow.
We had to go and first of all prove paternity. And then we had to prove that the connection between them was strong enough. And we had to go to one court, and then we had to appeal and then reappeal and go to the district court, back and forth. And finally, actually just before COVID hit, in March of 2020, they were reunited. And that for me was really a lovely case. In 2002, we got a Supreme Court ruling that said, we're not going to deal with Aliyah. We're not going to deal with the question of if a person can make Aliyah on the basis of conversion, but we will say that for the purpose of registration in your ID cards, we can't see any reason why conversion shouldn't be recognized by non-Orthodox streams as well, because Israel is a state, finally they said it, Israel is the state of all Jews from all backgrounds. Israel isn't just an Orthodox Jewish state. It is a state that recognizes the multiplicity of streams of Judaism. And when we're talking about the registration, which is a symbolic act and doesn't give anything apart from your registration in your ID card, we think that there should be no difference between Orthodox and non-Orthodox conversions. And so in 2002, the Supreme Court said from now on, a person who is converted non-Orthodox can be registered as Jewish, which meant a lot to the former Soviet Union new immigrants because that's what they were interested in. However, at that point in time, in fact, even until today, but at that point in time, the Minister of the Interior was from the Shas religious party, who said, over my dead body, there is no way that I'm going to accept that a non-Orthodox Jew will be recognized as such on their ID card. And so he ordered for the registration of nationality to be scrapped from people's ID cards. So from 2002, no longer can you be branded Russian, Ukrainian, Jewish, Arab. He knocked it all off. So in fact, I can be blamed for the fact that no one is no longer discriminated on their ID cards because he knocked it off for everybody. But what he didn't realize was that he could knock it off the ID cards. He couldn't knock it off the registration in the population registry. But even so, there was still a feeling that it doesn't really mean anything. So long as the conversion doesn't give anything more than this registration, it's not there. You're not there yet. And many of the population in Israel and out of Israel even said, well, if it doesn't mean anything, why should we do it? Because we can't gain anything from it. So the next stage was to try and breach the gap by having people study in Israel but convert abroad. Because up until that time, there was a sort of a general feeling that the politics regarding conversion in Israel didn't spread outside of Israel. And because there was a very strong understanding that Israel doesn't have a right to interfere and to judge what's happening outside of Israel, conversions performed in all streams of Judaism outside of Israel should be recognized. Again, it was never stated clearly, but that's what was happening in practice. So we felt that, okay, let's get these people to study in Israel, and then they can convert overseas, and we'll see what happens. Now, we're talking about 2002, 2003, at a time when more and more people were coming to Israel and settling either as former foreign workers or as spouses of Israelis who couldn't get automatic citizenship. So these were people who weren't citizens and they didn't have an automatic right to citizenship. Under the state of Israel, nobody who is not entitled under the law of return can get automatic citizenship. It's not like Australia or the States that if you live in Israel for a certain number of years, you can then be eligible for citizenship. There is no right for citizenship if you're not eligible under law of return. So these people who are either spouses of Israelis or were here on humanitarian grounds, refugees who had got some sort of status in Israel and wanted to convert to Judaism, if they converted non-Orthodox, they weren't given any status. And of course, getting status was ultimately very, very important so they could get citizenship. So we were teaching them in Israel and then sent them overseas to convert. And the Interior Ministry argued that that was a fictitious conversion overseas because they were actually studying in Israel. But the Supreme Court, again, it took a while, but in 2005 said, no. What counts is the fact that they were converted overseas, and we are making a definitive statement that anyone who is converted overseas in non-Orthodox congregations, Reform, Orthodox, and Conservative, will be will be recognized for the purposes of making Aliyah. And then came 2017, or actually came 2016. 2016 was another landmark decision for an Orthodox conversion performed in Israel. Now, the Supreme Court was very smart. They knew that the political backlash would be smaller if they made a decision about an Orthodox conversion, because how could the Orthodox in Parliament object to an Orthodox conversion being performed, even if it was performed privately? And this was a conversion performed by a Haredi rabbi sitting in Bnei Brak. But what they did was they basically used all our arguments. We sat there on the side, sort of giving all the arguments across, but it wasn't our case. And the Supreme Court in 2016 came down and said, any conversion, the same rule that we applied for overseas, any conversion performed in a recognized Jewish community around the world that should be recognized for the purpose of conversion should be recognized. And the same rule should apply in Israel if there's no legislation. So this Haredi rabbi in Bnei Brak was a very well-known rabbi, and they said, well, he's a recognized Jewish community, same as Reform conservative movements overseas. We'll recognize his conversion for the purpose of the law of return. Now, anyone who had their ears open and their eyes open would have known that the next step would be, therefore, the same logic should apply for non-Orthodox conversions. And so in 2017, they tried to pass another law because they knew what was coming. They knew that if this case was passed, our case would be next in line. It had to be next in line. We'd been waiting since 2005. And in 2017, they tried again. And again, they made a tactical error. They tried to pass this law at the time when the World Zionist Congress was having its sessions in Israel, and the World Zionist Congress is governed, or it was at that time, with many, many non-Orthodox Jews. And so they tried to pass this law while they were here, and they just all went to Netanyahu and said, forget it, mate, it's just not going to happen. And they backed down. Part of the reason they backed down actually was partially because of the Zionist Congress, but the other reason was because there is so much infighting between the Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox. They couldn't agree on the wording of the law. The ultra-Orthodox wanted the conversion issue to be governed by the ultra-Orthodox, and the Orthodox wanted it for them to have some flexibility into what decisions should be made. And actually, we were sitting there on the side thinking, keep fighting, it's good for us. And the law fell. And then we said to the Supreme Court, okay, enough is enough is enough. They're not managing to pass a law. We have people sitting here now, the number that was 12 that started had now become 50 because there were people throughout the years that had been joining. And the Supreme Court said to the state, we're giving you 6 months. 6 months went past and the state came back and said, we've got elections. Give us another 6 months. 6 months went past. We've got more elections. As you know, we had 4 elections over the last 2 years. And finally, in July 2020, the state said, give us another 6 months because we now have COVID and we can't meet and we can't make any decisions. And the Supreme Court said, we're going to give you 6 months. That's it, no longer. Come December 2020, the state asked again for another 6 months. And this time the Supreme Court said, no, we're not giving you any more time. But they wouldn't say when they were going to hand down the decision. And the elections were set down for the 23rd of March, and January went by, February went by, and we were feeling that there's no way they're going to hand down a decision so close to the elections because it will have such a strong backlash. And on the 1st of March, I was actually in the Interior Ministry in Jerusalem, helping a client who converted in Brazil, trying to get citizenship because the Interior Ministry didn't like the fact that he was a conservative rabbi in Brazil who was converting. And I'm sitting there, and I got an SMS to my phone saying, "Nikki, get back to the office. We're getting a decision in half an hour." Because in Israel, they don't invite you anymore to hear when the decision's being handed down. They just let you know it's going on the internet within half an hour. So I raced back to the office on the 1st of March, and then shit hit the fan, and we won. And it really was an amazing, not only feeling that all this fighting that we've been doing for 30 years had finally achieved fruition, but this time we had made a real difference, not only to the 50 people who we converted who are now eligible to make Aliyah and to get citizenship, but so many of the former Soviet Union people and Israeli citizens all of a sudden said, wow, now you have arrived. Now the reform and conservative movements are recognized for more than just something that's symbolic, for something that gives something that's serious. Citizenship is the most serious thing that you can actually give to someone. And they've been coming out like woodwork. And we're seeing now, well, about probably hundreds per week of people calling and saying, we want to convert with you. We want to be part of Israeli society, be recognized by Jews, and we want to be recognized as Jews through your movements, because your movement is what speaks to us.
The other big issue that Uri keeps talking about is allowing Jewish people to marry in Israel without having to choose an ultra-Orthodox rabbi. Is that going somewhere?
As I mentioned before, marriage as opposed to conversion is stuck in legislation. So in 1962, this law was passed that said marriage and divorce between Jews in Israel shall be according to Jewish law as interpreted by the rabbinate. The only way to change that is to pass another law. The Supreme Court doesn't have the power to say that law is non-constitutional because it was passed before they got their non-constitutional powers. So the chances that we manage to pass a law that says that either there'll be civil marriage or that there is the monopoly to the rabbinate for Jewish weddings will be broken, I think, is a long way off. Mm-hmm. That being said, what may well happen is that there will be an institutionalization of de facto couples. So more and more couples now are choosing not to get married so that the rabbinate can't influence their lives. And there are also couples who can't get married to the rabbinate because their Judaism isn't recognized by the rabbinate. For example, if you make Aliyah as a Reform convert, you can't get married in the rabbinate. If you are born to a Jewish father, you can't get married by the rabbinate. And so there is a large body of people who either can't get married by the rabbinate or don't want to because they don't want to be forced into the system of a non-equal marriage or the divorce process going through the rabbinate. And there has been a law passed that is called the civil union law, which says you can register your union or your partnership and basically have all the same rights and obligations as a married couple, but just not be registered as married. At the moment, that only applies to people who cannot get married in the rabbinate. And it also applies only to men and women. It doesn't apply to single-sex couples. Just before this last election, the Ministry of Justice passed a suggested change to that law, which would include everybody, which would include single-sex couples, which would include Jewish couples who don't want to get married in the rabbinate. And I think that has a much bigger chance of passing. Mm-hmm. The fact that if that gets passed and you can register your union and have all basically the same rights as a couple who's married, then the Orthodox monopoly on the rabbinate will stop having nearly as much influence. And
so that will mean that you can have your chuppah.
That's right.
At Beit Daniel, and then just register as a civil union.
That's right. And I think that's the way things. If a government is formed that is formed by the centralist parties, and you've got Lieberman and Saar and all those people who are quite secular in their outlook, there's quite a good chance that will go through.
Well, that would be almost revolutionary.
Yeah.
And that's the thing the ultra-Orthodox would no doubt most fear.
That's right.
LACO, where Nikki works, is funded very largely by communities such as ours. There are no Israeli government funds that go into it. And it's with the investment this community has been making that Nikki and her colleagues are able to do their work. In addition, there are now approximately 150 active Reform and Conservative congregations in Israel. As of 2 years ago, 13% of Israelis identified with the progressive Jewish movements, which is interestingly the same percentage as self-identify as ultra-Orthodox. And as Nikki has indicated tonight, our figures are likely to grow. The pandemic brought Israelis to an important representation, and that was only 21st century progressive Judaism allowed people to practice their Judaism when they were in lockdown. Mm-hmm. And for the first time ever, as Nikki mentioned, Gilad Kariv, who many of you will recall spoke to us just a few years ago, is now a member of the Knesset, elected on the Labour Party slate. These are all events that will help confirm Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. Please do give generously. This year, Karen and I have increased our contribution 10% because we can see the need, we can see the importance, and we know that right now the progressive movement is at a crossroads and is able to achieve so much for so many people. Thank you very much for joining us.
את כל הכוכבים תמן, את הסהר עטף בשחור, מצפון ועד תימן אין קרן לו. אור זרוע לצדיק ולישרי לב שמחה. 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 לצדיק ולישרי לב שמחה.